strange when I hear people say like, oh, it's about supporting the Palestinian rights. To me, the Palestinians have rights and they are being denied. I was walking back up a hill in Jerusalem, and I was wearing a white t-shirt, and I remember looking down at my white t-shirt and thinking, oh, I have a stain on my like t-shirt. And then as I was moving, the stain was moving, and I realized, I looked up, and of course at the top of the hill there was a military jeep with a sniper aimed right at my chest. And so in some neighborhoods you will literally have rows of houses, all Palestinian flags on one side and all Israeli flags on the other. But watching a 15-year-old boy or a 10-year-old boy get shot by a sniper, watching a girl have her leg amputated in her living room, teenage girl, watching baby corpses, of course all of this. When I step into that studio on that day, I am speaking from a place of grief and anger at the ways in which this is, I don't think that any of us thought that it could go on this long.
احنا اليوم عندنا ضيفة مميزة جدا، مريام فرانسوا أو إيميلي فرانسوا، ما عندها مشكلة بالاسمين، بتتحدث في أكثر من لغة، وخريجة، تخيل، واحدة خريجة كامبريدج، جورج تاون، أكسفورد، وعاشت في فلسطين في القدس، وعاشت كمان في المغرب، ودرست الحركات الإسلامية، وفي نفس الوقت عاشت تجربة هوليوود والسينما والتمثيل والدراما وصناعة الأفلام، وتنقلت في عدة مجالات أكاديمية وصحفية، وفي نفس الوقت انشهرت بمقابلاتها التلفزيونية بحديثها عن حقوق الإنسان. عندها جذور إيرلندية على جذور فرنسية، مع ولادة في لندن، بدون انتساب للثقافة البريطانية اللي بتعتبرها مسؤولة عن كثير من الكوارث، ومنها الاحتلال القائم بفلسطين. مريم خريجة كامبريدج، بعدين أكسفورد، تتقن أكثر من لغة، متفوقة، صحفية، فيلم ميكر. وأنت صغيرة كنت متخيلة نفسك راح تحققي هاي الأشياء؟
عندما كنت صغيرة كنت ممثلة، وأظن أن سأكون ممثلة عندما سيكون كبيرة. بس طبعا عندما بديت الحياة الممثلة أنا أشعر أن هذا الطريقة ليست طريقة علي، لأن لا أحببت الحياة اليومية في هذا العمل. إن لا عندك ما كان عندي الصوت، الصوت ممثلة صوت شخص أخرى، الشخص التي كان يكتب السيناريو.
تحس أنك تقدمين شخصية غير الشخصية التي تحبين.
هذا ليس فكرة أريد أني أنا سأشعر أن المهم في حياتي ليست الجسم، هي الفكرة أو الروح، مهم أكثر من الجسم.
ولذلك في 2004 اختارت مريام الإسلام.
صح، 203
2003 2004. كيف حدث ذلك؟
في طفولتي كان عندي كثير من الأصدقاء مسلم، هذا شيء عادي. طبعا أنا فرنسية، وفي فرنسا كثير من المسلمين، وأعيش في لندن وفي كثير من المسلمين، لذلك ما كان الإسلام شيء غريب علي. بس كان أعرف المسلمين بشكل عام شخص جيدا، بس ما عندي المعلومات عن الدين. أنا قررت أن دراسة الدين، وكان عندي أسأل كثيرا لأصدقائي، وهذا the story صورة صغيرة يعني فيه صورة طويلة جدا يعني
تفصيل هذا الأمر.
نعم.
فأنت بهاي المرحلة في التمثيل في صار معك قصة معينة وأنت ممثلة قالت لك يعني أنا خلاص أنا لا أرى نفسي هنا I don't find myself in this place.
Yeah. يعني عندي احترام للناس ممثلين بس for me يعني this is not the best way for me to express myself. I always felt like I had more to say than the role of actress would allow. But you know, there's a role for everyone to play. Everyone has a part to play. You know, for some people it's perfect. For me, I felt like I wanted to have control over the words.
حاجة محددة حصلت؟
يعني I think when I became Muslim عندما أسلمت لا أشعر إن هذا العمل جيد علي. أشعر إنه أريد أن أفعل شيء more active in the world. I wanted to be not just someone who you hand some words to say and you say those words. I have my own views. I want to understand the world and I want to share what I myself think about things, especially as a woman in the industry.
So then you change your name from Emily to Maryam.
Yeah, I don't mind if people call me Emily. My family, of course, still call me Emily, but في ثقافتنا الاسم شيء مهم جدا. يعني هذا فيه معنى، فيه تاريخ، فيه رسم symbol. I really looked up to people like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and these people who, when they became Muslim, they took a Muslim name. And they have a different story, of course. They're coming from the history of slavery and wanting to reclaim their identity. And طبعاً it's مختلف عن my story. But I was very inspired by this idea of choosing a name that has meaning, that helps to ground you in the world in a way that you choose. And of course, you know, Maryam alayhi salam is a very important figure for Muslims, for Christians. We have in her figure someone that we look to as being one of the highest spiritual masters to have lived on this earth, and also a single mother.
Any change in your relation with your family, extended family, when you convert to Islam?
عندما الناس they ask me this question, I always say, imagine tomorrow you became Christian. What will your family feel?
Shocked.
صعب عليهم لأن الناس بشكل عام الناس لا يفهمون الدين ولا يفهمون the concept of conversion. يعني معظم الناس they imagine that it is a rejection, but I don't see that at all. For me, becoming Muslim is never a rejection of anything. It's a confirmation of everything that came before. I believe that's what our faith teaches us. So it doesn't, for me, represent a break and a rejection, more of a continuity and an acceptance. And actually فيه احترام يعني، بس ليس هذا واضح للعائلة في البداية. طبعا بعد وقت يعني الشيء يغير
اعتادوا على ذلك يعني.
طبعا.
أنت يعني صحفية بريطانية مسلمة.
بريطانية لا أعرف. أنا من أصل إيرلندية وفرنسية، وطبعا ولدت في لندن، بس لندن ليست بريطانيا. لندن مختلف جدا عن بريطانيا، و خاصة بعد البريكسيت، وخاصة منذ سنة recent years، يعني أشعر إنني أنا ليس بريطانية. لا لا لا.
ما المشكلة؟
مشكلة في كثير من الليفلز، يعني في تاريخي، يعني إيرلندية، فيه احتلال مازال في إيرلندا، وأنا لا أظن إن my culture, it's not my culture. I feel London is my culture. London is a multicultural city. في لندن مثلا في شريعتي فيه فلسطينيين وسودانيين وإثيوبيين وسبانيش وكل الناس من العالم. I respect, of course, the country, and there are many great things about British people, but do I feel British? No.
French?
More French, yes.
Yeah.
Much more French, yeah. If I feel invested, it's much more in France, yeah.
But we have, for example, for Muslim community, they have more problems with the French culture than the British culture.
It's true. It's true. We have difficulties in France, but the history is also very different. During colonization, for example, Algeria was not just a colony. It was considered France. It was considered to be a department of France. If you were a Muslim in Algeria and you wanted to come to mainland France, you had to renounce your faith. You had to leave Islam.
So it's more difficult than UK.
The history is much more difficult. I think the history is much... there's difficult history in the UK, for sure. But, I went to a French school. درست التاريخ فرنسية، أحكي اللغة الفرنسية في البيت، يعني مع العائلة. I think that the story of the difficulty that we have in France is to do with our history and the way that we haven't confronted that history yet.
طيب، على كل، الآن بحدود 2003-2004 لما اختارت مريام الإسلام، ما الخطوة التالية؟
So when I became Muslim, I really wanted to go to one of our holy sites. And for me, Saudi Arabia was not the one. So I really wanted to go to القدس and to pray at Al-Aqsa, and that was very important to me on my spiritual journey. So I managed to find a job with a Palestinian NGO, which is run at the time by Lucy Nusaybeh, the wife of Sari Nusaybeh. And I was working in the West Bank for an organization called Middle East Nonviolence and Democracy at the time. And yeah, I had a, you're looking at me now probably thinking she looks very European, but I was wearing hijab at that time. And when I wear hijab, the most common assumption is that I am either Palestinian or Lebanese. This is every time. I get this all the time. Even now, I still get it. And when I was wearing hijab there, I would always be assumed to be Palestinian by both Palestinians and Israelis. So the Palestinians would always make fun of me. They would say, I can't believe, shame on your parents. They didn't teach you Arabic properly. These Palestinians, they go abroad and they don't even teach their kids Arabic. And, I would argue once or twice and I was like, no, it's fine. I'll just, you're right. And then with the Israelis at the checkpoint, it would regularly be the case that I would hand over my passport, French passport, and I would get a comment. My favorite one was a dog that's born in a barn isn't a cow. So make of that what you will. So just, one of the lovely delights that you experience day to day في حياتها اليومية تحت الاحتلال يعني. But I had many different experiences when I was there. For one, I learned a lot about my faith. I learned a lot about my religion, as it's, those of us who live in the West, we experience Islam as a minority, but it's very different to live in a Muslim majority country. So different. And so important to understand that there is so much breadth in how people practice their faith and how they live their faith. And that actually some of the intolerance, I think, that we have sometimes in even here in the West amongst each other was not my experience of living in Muslim majority countries, whether in Palestine or in Morocco. I did not have that experience. I saw much more acceptance of a real range of people, and I took that with me going forward, that actually this idea that there's only one way to be Muslim is like so different, so disconnected from the reality of how our faith is a living, breathing tradition that is embodied in different ways in different parts of the world, and that's a richness, not a weakness. And I think, of course, one of the ways that it shaped me was in my experience of the occupation. I've said before that the ways in which when you live under military occupation, you don't forget it. It's a very significant experience to have assault rifles in your face every day, to always live in fear that, you could put a foot wrong and you could end up in detention, you could end up disappearing, and, the abuses of power that are happening around you daily. You're conscious that it's really just one step away from you. So, I have like stories that I tell. Like I was playing at the time for a basketball team in Jerusalem. We're a Palestinian basketball team. And so we used to go out and play games in the West Bank. And one time we were coming back from a game and we were ridden off the road by a settler. And it was a bad accident and multiple people injured. I experienced a very severe break on my arm. My wrist disconnected from my forearm in the accident. And so I actually thought I'd lost my hand, because when I raised my hand, it was hanging down here like a basket, and I was like, oh, I've lost my hand. But there were lots of people injured, and I remember vividly that when the ambulance came, we had to figure out who had what ID.
Wow.
Yeah. To see where people could go to get treated. And I remember that so vividly, because I had to go back into the wreckage of the car to find my passport so that I could get treated in the nearest hospital, which was an Israeli hospital, where I have to say they did treat me very well. The staff treated me well. But that was a lot of inhumanity, because half the team had Palestinian ID and they were from the West Bank, and they had to go to a different hospital, and those of us who could get into Jerusalem,
they don't care for the situation, what happened.
They treat everyone on the site, like obviously immediately, but when it comes to where we had to go to hospital to get treated, no, that was apartheid. That was, some people get to go to an Israeli hospital and some people don't. And some people that were very badly injured should have gone to the closest hospital.
These small stories encourage you to support the Palestinian rights?
See, I don't see
or something before that.
I see it as, it's strange when I hear people say like, oh, it's about supporting the Palestinian rights. To me, the Palestinians have rights and they are being denied. So they don't need my support. They don't need anyone's support. Those rights are rights. They exist independently. Even if there was not a single person on this earth that gave testimony to the injustice, it would still be injustice. Like what we're seeing happening is, you know, a brutal military occupation in which a population is subjected to unequal laws based on race. And I don't think anyone needs me to point out why that's a problem. And if you do, I'm sorry for you if you need me to explain why that's a problem. It's not for me to break that down. It's a very clear, well-documented case of military occupation, illegal military occupation. It's a very well-documented case of widespread abuses of a civilian population by, an occupying power that has a responsibility under international law to actually protect and provide for that population. So, you know, I don't see this as something that needs rallying for per se. I think it's more a case of when you see it for what it is. And of course, when you live there, it's very obvious because you experience it firsthand. You know, I told you this one story with a settler, but I have another story of like walking back from training one day, again, walking back from basketball. And I was walking back up a hill in Jerusalem, and I was wearing a white t-shirt, and I remember looking down at my white t-shirt and thinking, oh, I have a stain on my like t-shirt. And then as I was moving, the stain was moving, and I realized, I looked up, and of course at the top of the hill there was a military jeep with a sniper aimed right at my chest, and they kept that on me the whole time that I walked up the hill.
You are under fire.
Well, not me, everyone, right? I'm not special. I'm not exceptional.
Like anyone.
They just saw what they assumed was a Palestinian walking up a hill, and they did what they call, you know, these, what do they call them? Spontaneous checkpoints, right? I don't know if you've ever experienced these, but, you know, if you live there, you have them all the time. You might be walking home one evening with some friends, having a good time, and then suddenly, and then like 10 meters up the road, they will just park up. Everyone will get out, you know, checkpoint. Why? We're just walking along the street. So these are forms of harassment that were very recognizable to me. You know, it's a harassment that we've seen African Americans experience under, you know, the pre-civil rights era, and arguably till this day, they continue to experience that, as do Black people in most parts of the world. Still have one of my best friends who lives in Jerusalem, and I speak to her regularly, and she and a lot of people I knew from that time are so distressed because you can't even post a Palestinian flag on your social media without there being potential consequences for that. You know, I don't think that this is a complicated issue. I know we hear this a lot with the Palestinian issue. This is a very complicated conflict. I don't think it's complicated. I think what might be complicated is the history and how we got to where we are, because of course we start the story during a colonial era where the way that the world is divided between colonial powers is, you know, unquestioned. And so the idea that Britain can somehow give away land that was never theirs is a different set of understandings about the world than what we have today, right? We no longer consider that to be an acceptable thing. And therefore, how do you sort of manage the outcome of a decision that was made under a very different set of particular circumstances? But in terms of the occupation itself, I don't think it's complicated at all.
Do you think this emotional feeling regarding the Palestinian right became from your half Irish roots?
You know, it's funny. It comes from both. So people may not realize, but we do have a really also strong Palestinian advocacy group, I would say, or groups in France as well. And you've got to remember that France for a long time, especially in the post-war era, was very opposed to simply following the American line. You know, we were very much of the view that, you know, the sort of aid package that that America offered Europe so kindly after the Second World War was a form of imperialism of its own, which meant that American products, cultural, consumer products were flooding Europe. And because obviously we were in a post-war era, unable to kind of produce to the same standards or levels, that was a sort of exploitative move on behalf of the Americans. Of course, they arguably saved the day. That's the narrative, but it came at a cost. And the French were very clear on that cost. And so I think that for a long time in France, we have had a part of the political class that is skeptical of American global leadership as somehow benign. This is not, we've seen Dominique de Villepin, the former prime minister, speak out recently. He has a pretty good understanding of the Middle East. And if you listen to his statements, he is in that lineage of leaders who did not really regard the US as a benign force in the world.
Is that way of thinking for the majority of the French people?
Today, probably not, but it's definitely there. And I wouldn't pretend that it's not. It's definitely still there. We're a rebellious people. It's in our blood. It's in our politics. It's in our street politics. It's how we even debate. We have that Mediterranean kind of passionate thing going on that we are not easily controlled as a people.
Yeah. So the French Irish.
And then you marry that to the Irish. Yeah. And then you marry that, of course, to the Irish, which, of course, to me, my great grandfather was, killed by the Black and Tan, who were a paramilitary group that the British were essentially using to do their dirty work in Ireland. And this group was made up of former convicts, the worst of the worst, who were in many cases serving life sentences and who were offered reprieve if they would come and serve in the British Army in Ireland. And of course, when they were unleashed on civilians in villages, they raped and they killed.
So we have the same situation.
We have similar, there are some definite parallels. And if you go to Northern Ireland now, so for some Irish people, and of course, you'll have heard Sinn Féin speak very publicly in defense of the Palestinian rights. And of course, Sinn Féin, which is likely to be the ruling party in Northern Ireland, much to many people's dismay, no doubt. We are talking about a party that believes in the unification of Ireland, right? That believes that there is an ongoing occupation happening in Northern Ireland and advocates for the freedom of the whole of the Isle. Yeah, so I think, Irish people, not all of them, but a significant number of Irish people understand the Palestinian occupation and see parallels with what is considered to be Britain's first colony, right? Ireland was Britain's first colony. And so many people would regard there to be parallels. And if you go to Northern Ireland today, any day over the last few years, you will forever, really, that I would know, you would have Catholic houses, which is the majority in Ireland, in Ayr, which is free Ireland or unoccupied Ireland, as some might say. They will have Palestinian flags in their windows everywhere. And the Protestants who are associated with British settlers who were brought over to create a numerical majority, in the same way we see the settlements being done to create a numerical majority, or what we call a reality on the ground, they fly Israeli flags from their windows. And so in some neighborhoods, you will literally have rows of houses, all Palestinian flags on one side and all Israeli flags on the other. So this is very close.
هذا يشابه تشجيع فرق كرة القدم في اسكتلندا. الذين يشجعون سلتك يرفعون أعلام، والذين يشجعون الفريق الآخر يرفعون الأعلام الأخرى.
Yes, of course, the Celtics who were told not to wear who were banned actually from wearing the Palestinian colors to the stadium. And so what did they do? They wore the colors to the stadium because you don't tell Celtic people what to do.
كل هذه التجربة، ولكن أول فيلم لك لم يكن له علاقة بفلسطين، كان له علاقة بآيسيس وبداعش.
لا أظن أن فيلمي عن هذا الموضوع. يعني فيلمي عن
العثور على علاء.
It's on a grandfather searching for his missing granddaughter. Only it's not just any grandfather. It's the father of one of the main attackers involved in the 2015 Paris attacks, and his granddaughter is missing in northern Syria. And the film tracks his search for little Ala and the difficulties that he encounters on that search. But also it's the story of his attempts to find reconciliation with the wider society that assumed that he was somehow complicit with what happened, even though he and his family tried everything they could to stop Sami doing what he did. But we never heard that story. We never heard that actually I consider his family to be what I call the other victims of ISIS. They are families whose children were taken from them and sent to be cannon fodder. For what? For what? You know? And so this family also experienced huge amounts of pain and grief and loss. And they were also victims of what happened that day in their own way. And I felt that that was a very important story to tell, so that we could try and step out of this very polarized understanding of those events and what should or did flow from them.
طيب احنا يعني هل المشكلة في هدول الناس المتطرفين، ولا هو اصلا انه في الغرب او في الويسترن بيبل في ناس اصلا بيكرهونا ايش مع منا، ولا هم التنين مع بعض؟
التنتين. يعني التنتين. Yeah. A lot of the governments mirrored the language of these extremist groups. They were basically saying that, you know, this happened, these events happened. To us Muslims, we looked at it, the majority of us were looking at it going, oh my, you know, them over there, right? We weren't thinking, oh, we were thinking them over there did this. But to the rest of wider society, increasingly the discourse was that the problem was with Muslims بشكل عام, يعني that all of us should be surveyed, all of us should be under suspicion, that something maybe within the religion was the problem. And I think that it was important for me to put forward a family who I think have a very normal, balanced, you know, practice of Islam, and that their son took this very extreme route. I'm sorry to say, for me, deviant route. In that it caused so much harm to so many people, and I felt that all of us, Muslims, wider society, everyone needed to hear the story of a family who was caught in the middle of all of this, because in the complexity of their experience is some of the nuance that's missing from our understanding of what happened.
يعني أنا أشعر بذلك، وإحنا نعيش هذه القصص يعني يوميا بهذا السياق. بعدين أنت كملتي وقررتي تدرسي الدكتوراه PhD، وذهبت إلى المغرب، يعني الدراسة في أكسفورد ولكن التطبيق في المغرب. لماذا المغرب؟
قبل هذا أنا درست 2 في جامعة جورج تاون، حيث هناك أنا كان عندي الماسترز في Arab Studies، ودرست اللغة العربية صح. وبعد هذا بدأت
يعني درست اللغة العربية ليس في القدس وإنما في أمريكا؟
في البداية في القدس، وبعد هذا في أمريكا في جامعة جورج تاون 2 خلال الماسترز، وبعد هذا
بس والله هنا قبل قليلا، أول شيء أكسفورد وهي من أهم الجامعات في العالم وأرقاها، ثم جورج تاون وهي من أحسن الجامعات، ثم أكسفورد. أنت كنت يعني تتقصدين تريدين الذهاب the top universities لأفضل الجامعات؟
طبعا في البداية في كامبريدج، وبعد هذا في جورج تاون، وبعد هذا في أكسفورد.
كامبريدج، جورج تاون، أكسفورد. يعني أنت تتعمدين الذهاب إلى التوب يونيفرسيتي، إلى أفضل الجامعات؟
طب yeah it's I'm someone who believes that if you're going to do something, you should try and do it well. In everything. I suppose in some ways I would say that this probably precedes my faith, but my faith confirms the idea that it's like a gratitude thing, right? If you have the ability to do something, then you should do it, and you should do it well, and you should do it in service to something higher than yourself. And that is how my faith sort of is the prism through which I filter reality. And so I try always to honor those values of excellence in whatever it is that I'm doing. I think you owe it to yourself, you owe it to the people that you're working with, and you owe it ultimately to the issues that you are in service to, you know, raising awareness around, or, you know.
Great.
Yeah.
ودرستي إذا كملتي اللغة العربية في جورج تاون. كان في هنالك يعني مواقف تتذكرينها في هذه السنتين في أمريكا، في أشياء معينة صارت معاكي؟
So, you know, I was still wearing hijab at this time, and it's, you know, it's post 9/11 America. It's 2005, 2000 to 2007, and it was pretty tense. You know, it was pretty tense, I would say. But I studied under some incredible people at Georgetown. The Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown is fantastic, absolutely incredible. I studied under John Esposito, John Vol, Ahmed Dalal. Got to work as a teaching assistant for Professor Judith Tucker. We really had some incredible professors who were teaching us, who were, you know, who were always trying to make us think from an Arab world perspective. Which is good. That's what the Arab Studies program should do. Yeah. If you come out of Arab Studies and you haven't understood how the Arab world is thinking, and of course, it's the Arab world is a big term. People think very differently, but there's some commonalities, of course. And if you haven't got that by the end of it, you should definitely fail the program. So I had a great time. But I have a story actually that comes to, you know, I tell this one a lot, but when we were there was, I think it was like some big interfaith event was being organized on the campus, and the campus had an imam, campus imam. Not all universities did. Most universities obviously have a campus chaplain, and they might have a campus rabbi, but not everywhere had a campus imam. So for Georgetown, this was a great thing. And so we had this interfaith event, and multiple denominations of the Christian faith were invited to speak, and several different Jewish groups were invited to speak, but not a single Muslim was invited to speak. The imam was invited to attend, but not to speak. And so it was George Bush Jr. at that time. He was hosting the event, and the imam said to him, took him aside at a certain point, and he said, Mr. President, I would just like to know, this is an interfaith event. I would like, it's fabulous. You have so many Christian denominations, so many Jewish denominations. Can I just ask why you didn't think to include any Muslims to speak today? And George Bush responded to him, that's because we're a Judeo-Christian civilization. And so the imam said to him, oh, okay. And so what is it that Jews and Christians share that we Muslims don't share with you? And George Bush Jr. responded, Jesus Christ. Wow. Which, of course, for anyone that knows ABC theology will know that actually Jesus is probably the figure that Muslims and Christians do share, but that Jews definitely don't share the same perception of. And so to hear that level of ignorance from a president who had been in charge of, probably one of the worst, historical tragedies in modern Middle Eastern history. I mean, the consequences of the invasion of Iraq are still being felt to this day, right? I mean, if you knew Iraq before and you knew, this country that had and it was not perfect, far from it. It had a lot of problems, but, a highly educated population, and there was certainly considerable wealth, which is, of course, part of, no doubt, why it was targeted. To see what it's been reduced to now is heresy. It's heresy. It is only because we filter the world through a sort of a Western bias that we do not fully take stock of the enormity of the harm that was done not just to Iraq, but to the region, but specifically to Iraq. And I want to pay homage to the Iraqis who've been through so much. And their pain and their ongoing instability, if I'll just use that euphemism for now, that they continue to live through, has not really been honored, in my opinion. It has not really been fully America has not been held to account for what happened.
شو كان أهم إشي طلعتي فيه من المغرب؟
درست الحركات الإسلامية في المغرب، وخاصة حركة اسمها الحركة
العدل والإحسان.
لا، العدل والإحسان فيه
العدالة والتنمية.
نعم، العدالة والتنمية، بس فيه تنتين من الحركات كبيرة. نعم. في المغرب
التوحيد والإصلاح،
تجديد وإصلاح،
والعدل والإحسان.
العدل والإحسان، والعدل والإحسان يعني هذا من الشيخ ياسين. نعم. بس دكتوراتي عن العدالة والتنمية. يعني the reason يعني for me Morocco, so for people who don't know much about Morocco has quite a unique history compared to the rest of the Muslim world, right? When I was doing my master's, there was a lot of interest in Islamic political movements and Islamic political thought. And if you remember sort of the late 2000s, this is around the same period that we're seeing the rise of the AK party in Turkey. And we are seeing kind of Islamic political movements across the Arab world sort of gain some level of political support, and I think maybe some hope that this could represent, as I think François Burgat, the academic, said, the final stages of the la fusée, which is the rocket of decolonization. This is something that he described. I think I was very interested in I was less interested in the extremist thought, which is what everyone wanted to study. Everyone wanted to study Al-Qaeda and, these guys. And, it's interesting to me to see their reasoning. And I did study that to understand how we get to a certain view on certain rulings, which seems so at odds with the wider ethos of the faith. But I was much more interested in the normal guys, the normal men and women,
the middle.
What are the regular people who are just trying to figure out? We have a faith that historically had, a wider framework for the regulation of society and politics and governance. And is there anything in that can be of value to the contemporary era? I was interested in that question.
في أي سنة؟
بديت في المغرب في 2009.
2009.
So I was very interested in العدالة والتنمية because they the group that I studied is actually called التوحيد والإصلاح. They are the movement that
the mother of العدالة والتنمية.
Correct.
الآن بقيتي 7 سنوات في المغرب ولا كنتي تذهبي وتأتي؟
تذهب
نعم. طيب الآن في 2008 كان في حرب على غزة، 2012 2014. هل كنت يعني أنت متفاعلة مع هذه الأحداث مع غزة يعني؟
Yeah, I mean, I have always supported social justice at an international level, whether that was for Palestine, whether that was for Iraq. I was present in vocalizing my view, which I don't regard as anything other than my responsibility, both as someone with an academic background and as a journalist, to try and remedy what is a very unbalanced understanding of regional dynamics. I don't see that as advocacy. I don't see that as activism. I see that literally as just trying to better inform both the public and my colleagues in some cases about stories that are so important and are sometimes deeply mischaracterized.
الناس سمعوا بك وبحديثك عن غزة أكثر شيء هذه المرة، لماذا؟
Maybe because of social media. I think maybe social media this time has been much more, I've only been on social media myself probably for about, I want to say the last 4 or 5 years. Actively, I would say. I mean, on Instagram. I was on Twitter for a lot longer, but or X as we call it today. I don't know why. I think obviously people saw the Sky clip. That's what went viral. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people are doing a lot of great work that never goes viral. And they're still doing it.
خلينا نحكي شوي على مقابلة سكاي نيوز. لماذا كنت خلينا نقول منفعلة إلى كل هذه الدرجة وأنت في مقابلة سكاي؟
Well, what came before the Sky interview was 2 months of watching day in, day out, civilians being slaughtered, children in bits, mothers crying. I have, like most people who are following this closely, been live streaming a genocidal assault with all the violence that means on a day-to-day. And I would be lying to myself if I didn't say that hasn't affected me deeply. I think it has, I'm not alone. Those of us who are watching these things very frequently, daily, multiple times a day, watching videos, content that shows levels of extreme violence inflicted on, often in many cases children. It's bad on when it's on anyone, but watching a 15-year-old boy or a 10-year-old boy get shot by a sniper, watching a girl have her leg amputated in her living room, teenage girl, watching baby corpses, of course all of this. When I step into that studio on that day, I am speaking from a place of grief and anger at the ways in which this is, I don't think that any of us thought that it could go on this long. I really don't. I think a lot of us thought, that the public pressure, that our governments wouldn't stand for it, and I that's probably naive. But
دائما عندنا مشكلة أنه المذيعين الذين يسألون مثل رأينا كثير من المواقف المتطرفة، هل هم فعلا ما عندهم معلومات أم أن هم تحت تأثير الرواية الإسرائيلية؟
اوكي، في كثير من الأشياء في هذا السؤال، بس في البداية believe that there is a severe lack of literacy in the media when it comes to the Middle East. Probably not just the Middle East, by the way, but you have to remember that I am in a very privileged position. I have lived in the region. I, speak very badly Arabic, but I have a little gauge of the language. I have done a master's and a PhD, so I have a sense of the region. But most journalists are not, right? They don't have that, and so they are in many ways asking questions that are rooted in the interests of the countries in which they locate themselves. You might argue that's even probably very natural. It's, they're asking how do these events happening over there affect our interests over here? Where I think it's a little short-sighted, and this is where I say there's a lack of literacy about the international and global politics, the sort of geopolitical dimension of what we're looking at, is that when we think about what is in our interests, يعني في الغرب مثلا, I don't think that that's still the question. Where, our trade routes are going to be... There's a much, much bigger question about who we are in the world as Western powers, the role that we exercise, how that position is changing now that all other global powers are on the rise and seeking to shift the balance of power that has existed. And is it still today, with the rise of China and Russia and India, is it still today the best policy for us in the UK or the West to be aligning ourselves with what is essentially a rogue state that is continuously and persistently defying the rule-based order that was created in the wake of the Second World War to protect world peace? Is that still in our interest? And my view is that it is not. My view is that it is not. And my view is that we would be safer here, but also there, if there was a resolution of this conflict that honored the rights of everyone that finds themselves in that land. That is, to me, a much more salient question that should be posed at this particular point than shipping routes.
طب نحن كمجتمع عربي ومسلم في بريطانيا ما المطلوب منا أن نفعله حتى نعدل هذه النظرة قليلا؟
Well, we definitely need more Arab and Muslim journalists in the media. We already have a huge problem with a lack of representation of minorities in the media, right? I think it's less than 3% of journalists are journalists of color. It's predominantly a very, very white profession. Now, of course, there are some great journalists who are white. I mean, I can think of a few people, but I think that the perspective that comes with being from the culture, understanding the history, speaking the language is completely different, and that we need more range of perspectives. We need a more diverse range of perspectives in the newsroom. We also need people who, you mentioned sort of the Israeli lines, in my understanding of our profession as journalists, when we look at a conflict and we have information coming out of the conflict zone, we have a responsibility never to take the word of a government that is at war at face value. Any government that is at war is also engaged in propaganda. They go hand in hand. There is no exception to that rule. And so I think if I have a criticism about some of the coverage is that I think that there is a racial element, a form of racism at play in what we're seeing, which is that Israelis, well, they're just like us. Well, which is, of course, because in many cases they literally are us. They are European and Westerners who've gone and settled in the region, but they look like us. They go to music festivals just like us. And so there is a sort of proximity, a sense of proximity by virtue of that, which means that there is an inherent bias towards them in how we humanize them, in how we, afford sympathy to them. And by the way, just to be clear, Israelis deserve sympathy too, because everybody deserves sympathy. But the problem that we have right now is that it's only the Israelis that are worthy of sympathy, that actually we don't see any commensurate or equivalent amount of empathy afforded to the Palestinians. And we so very rarely
So
hear.
we need more journalists.
We need more journalists, certainly.
Second,
I think we probably, if I was, pitching this to some wealthy Arab donors, I would say, places like the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown train a new generation of thinkers to go out into the world and share understanding that is wider than what you would get if you didn't study the Middle East. And so we probably need more funding of centers of learning and education that help people to truly understand things outside of a Western-centric lens.
طيب المجتمع نفسه هنا الآن our community العرب والمسلم community إحنا عندنا انتخابات قادمة
في بريطانيا.
نعم.
So I would never tell anyone who to vote for. It's really not my position to do that. I think that we have seen, obviously, a movement of rebellion within Labour coming from not just Muslims, but principally led by Muslim MPs who have said, either that they're resigning from Labour or that, it's inconceivable that we should vote for Labour. I think that we place too much emphasis on the highest levels of political organization, meaning the political parties and the national elections. A lot of power resides at the local level. And I think that what I would hope we would see more of is less of this sort of passive approach to politics where we just expect a great leader to come and to change the world, and more of an active participation in local politics, which then filters up to regional, which filters up eventually to national. And I think that that's both empowering to communities, but it also means that the policies that we'll be demanding are directly related to the needs of the communities. Because if you're working from the bottom up rather than from top down, I think you generally see policies that are more in line with the needs of the community.
إذا عندك نصيحة بتحبي تحكيها لأصدقائك العرب في بريطانيا.
There's a lot of money in the Arab community. And we live in a capitalist world where money is power. And all I will say is that there is a significant gulf between the wealth and power of the Arab community and the manifestation of that power in global politics.
جميل. أنا أشكرك جدا.